going to start with the recording. So today's session will cover risk management and we'll also cover change control. But those two elements are the elements that need to be included in your assignment, your last assignment. So basically, by now you would have had everything for your assignment to be. It was extended. But if you have any questions as well, don't hesitate to ask me once I'll finish the lecture here, or you can email me later on. So we've all heard risk. We know what risk is, and we sort of have a broad idea of how pretty much to deal with it. Because when you join a company for the first time, there is always a risk management training on how to deal with unexpected issue and what's the procedure. But then here, it's more about how to manage those risks. In a project as well, you know that there is always, or there will always be unexpected event happening, and you have to be prepared on how to deal with and have a proper process of how to overcome those events as well. So starting with this sort of a subdivision, so you do have this particular consulting brief, okay? So it's a bit small here, but if you zoom in the lecture slide that is provided on Canvas, you'll notice that this consulting brief is a 5,000 consulting brief project, and that report sort of shows advice or provide advice on a property development around that subdivision. And the consultant brief recommended that infrastructure was available around that area and that the land was viable for development, so it can be used. And you can see it's actually the boundaries shown in blue color. So the developer who purchased the land asked for a consulting report advice if he could go ahead and build, and that's what has been briefly provided to him or her. So the question is, if you look at a subdivision like that or a project like that, what sort of risk do you think could potentially be involved, or what could potentially go wrong in a subdivision like that? Because the consulting brief will give you an overview of whether or not the project is feasible, and this one particularly is saying that it's feasible without actually mentioning any sort of potential unexpected event. But when you think about that, what sort of unexpected event could happen around that subdivision? Any idea? Okay, so anyone want to give it a try? Environmental issues, yes, because it's a subdivision, and some of the things would have been to test the water supply, for example, or anything underneath that to know exactly that nothing will go wrong. Or we could have town planning issue, land can sink, yes, environmental problems, or even some problem with neighboring projects as well, or neighbors as well during building. So yeah, those are the risk that the consulting report wouldn't probably or would have missed probably. So it's up to the project management team to also think on their own about potential risk that might affect that particular project. You could have tests, you could have reports, but you also have to sit down with your own team and brainstorm what sort of risk would affect a particular project. So this week we'll talk about the concept and definition of risk, the steps involved in managing risk, the common risk categories, and the risk breakdown structure. So in terms of the concept and definition, we know for a fact that in projects, there always gonna be uncertainties. So you will never have a project that goes according to plan from the start and beginning. And this is because this is just the reality of how projects work. There was always uncertainty involved with projects. But now the level of this uncertainty can be measured. However, no amount of planning can overcome risk. So you are not actually thinking of stopping all the risks that might come to affect your project by just thinking about how to reduce some of those impacts that the risk might have. You know that there will be risk because that's just the nature of projects. But if they happen, you want to find a way to minimize their impact. So all of that is about when you think about the impact, you're thinking about who might be affected and what might be affected as well. So it's the impact in terms of your project, what you put in your project, but in terms of also people that are involved in that particular project. How would you minimize or reduce the impact of that particular uncertainty if it happens? So when we talk about the concept of risk, there is the level of uncertainty because obviously you're expecting some unforeseen events. So you're doing a project with thinking of what sort of unforeseen event can potentially happen. So that's what we refer to as risk. But then there is a difference between hazard and risk. Does anyone know the difference between hazard and risk? What's a hazard? Okay, I'm gonna give you context. If you're driving your car, especially in Melbourne, in the middle of the night, it's pouring rain, so heavy storm, and you haven't seen it, but because there's poor visibility, it's dark, there is a kangaroo standing right there in the middle of the road, like in the countryside of Victoria. So, is that kangaroo, how would you consider that kangaroo? Is it a risk or is it a hazard? Rachel say hazard. Why would you consider the kangaroo as a hazard? Because it's there. Yeah. Why it's not a risk? Because obviously it's unexpected. You just realize that there's a kangaroo right in your vision or in the road when you're driving. Driving itself would be a risk. Yes, at night with a cool raining sort of weather, but I'm trying to make a difference between a hazard and a risk. So the kangaroo there is there, and you think it's a hazard. Perhaps you have to remember a hazard is a danger. If you Google hazard, it's danger. So the kangaroo is a danger to you, your safety. If you're with your family in the car, that's a danger. It will become a risk, obviously, if you hit that kangaroo and that kangaroo or that accident has an impact. So if the hazard move, let's say the kangaroo notices that you're coming as well, and it moves out of your road or your vision, and there is no more kangaroo, so that hazard is gone, the danger is gone, and obviously it didn't become a risk to you because there was no impact. It was unfortunate you didn't plan for a kangaroo to be there, but it didn't become a risk because that didn't happen. So with the risk, there are two elements in it. There's the likelihood, the probability that an unforeseen event will happen, but there is also an impact. If it happens, there will be an impact. As minimal as it is, as huge as it is, there is a certain impact. So how strong the impact is or how low the impact is, that's what we call the degree of risk or the level of risk. It's only a hazard when it doesn't impact you or the project. It's a danger, it's there, it's sitting there, it will remain a hazard. Okay. John said my mic keeps cutting off. Is it how you all hear me as well? So it's not clearly working? Oh no. Okay. I'm gonna do the usual. I'm gonna log in completely from my computer and come in and come back. Okay, is it better now? No. Okay. Okay, just bear with me. My internet here is always causing problem. So what I'm gonna do is log out and come back. Okay, just stay on Collaborate Ultra and I'll do it as quickly as I can.
Anyone out there have the joy of having to get some rapid tests for children at school for this week?
We managed to get about 200.
You got 200?
Yeah.
Are you hoarding them, or are you a school teacher?
No, my wife works at a department, so because she works for a not-for-profit, she had to get them for her staff and for all the kids that are in the housing program that she runs.
Okay.
Everybody else had to do rat tests. Has anybody else got a cat to follow rats?
No, but I've got
That's
my
a
son
no.
home from daycare today because they've had to get PCR tested because of an outbreak at daycare. So that's fine.
Wow.
Well, how young's your son, Eleanor?
2.
Do
Yeah.
they, when
Cool.
you get the PCR test, is it the same as the adult one? Like,
Yeah, it is. Yep.
gee, they must be very careful not to put it too far up your son's
Yeah.
nose.
Yeah, you've got to hold him down, restrain him entirely. Yep.
Oh, so you can't do the drive-through one because you'd have to get out of the car then, wouldn't you?
I just get in the back seat and hold him down.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, man, that's pretty. How's that for him?
He screams and he knows now because he's had a couple. Yeah, it's not fun.
Wow.
Yep.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. You'd think we'd be used to all this by now, but it just never gets easier.
No.
No.
Erica
Yeah,
looks like she might be back.
Yeah, just
Is
testing.
Erica?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me? No. Can you hear
We
me?
can hear you. Yes.
Okay, so I was about to go out again. Okay, thinking what's going on with this this computer. Okay, so did I miss something about, I don't know, you were talking about your son?
Oh, yeah, we were just talking about COVID testing, and I said my son's home today because there was an outbreak at daycare, so he had to get the PCR test, so we're waiting for that to come back. It's been, 30 hours now. We still don't have it back, so
I
yeah.
heard that it's quite slow in Australia. It's actually much faster here to get a
Is it?
result.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, well, he's got to stay home, so I've been working with him at home today, and it's just a nightmare.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because my sister had also tested. Well, she thinks she has COVID because of the symptoms, but she was still waiting for her results, and
Mhm.
it's taking quite some time as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so going back to where we stopped, we're talking about how a hazard is danger, and while it's sitting there, it has no impact on you, so you can either ignore it, avoid it. But when you have that hazard, or you, let's say you hit the kangaroo on the streets, then that would have an impact, and that impacts whether it's less or big. It makes, or all of this make become a risk, because there is that element of the likelihood, the probability of some sort of unforeseen event to become a reality. And once it becomes a reality, it will have an impact or a consequence. So risk has two components. It's not just about something that might be a danger in the future or might be a danger right now, but or might happen. But it's also about something that if it happens would have some sort of consequence, whether it's small or big. But that would determine the degree of risk or the level of risk. So now look at this particular scenario here and think about this. This is a scenario that I normally use to describe some of the risks that would have bigger impacts and some that would have low impact. So for these two particular scenario here, let's say a car crash and a plane accident. Which accident is the most likely to happen? So we're thinking about the likelihood of that particular unforeseen event. Which one is the most likely to happen? Car accident, especially because we use car more often. Yeah. And which accident will have the most impact if it happens? The plane, because plane have a lot more people in there. So which one, if between a car accident and a plane crash, will have a higher degree of risk? Or which one is the riskier? To put it into context, we're putting into, let's say, in a year in Melbourne, between the two type of accident, which one would you consider to be the riskier? In a period of 1 year, in the context of Melbourne. The car. Why would you say the car, Leona? Okay, higher rates of probability. David say it depends, and it depends on what modes of transport you take. So the most popular mode of transport in Melbourne is car. Rachel, depends on how you weight the impact of the likelihood. Yeah, so in this context here, we put a context around it. We say in a year, and in a year you would have more car accident than you would have for plane crash in Melbourne or in Melbourne sky, and you would have a lot more impact from car accident because of the amount of time the plane crash is happening. So here, the risk here is the car, because there is more impact. If you quantify them, so you take the number of impacts or the number of people affected by car accidents, you will probably end up with more in about a year than you would have for a car crash, a plane crash in one time plane crash, which is really unlikely to happen in Melbourne. So it's also the probability. You have to remember that the risk of a or the degree of risk depend on both the likelihood, the probability, and the impact. So some of the type of accident or hazard or even danger will look. Yes, Omar.
Erika, just a request from me. I'm having difficulty to understand these examples and having them related with specific to the project management and the assessments we are working on. So I would really appreciate if you can give examples which are actually related to the projects, like what kind of
Yep.
risks or has we can come across while we are
Yes.
working on those projects. So because it's making me really confused, to be honest, and I'm really worried, like I'm not being able to grasp what I should be learning or getting out of it.
Yes. You will. We will get to that. The next slide talks more about project. This is to give you the context of the concepts of risk in general.
Thank you.
So we want to understand first what risk mean and then how we relate to projects a little bit later. So just bear with me here. And I think I've got a comment from David. 20,100 crashes in the US for 2021, where there were 1,301 plane crashes. That's a lot. And I'm assuming you got the data from Google online. That's a lot of plane crash in the US for just 2020. And bear in mind that 2021 was actually during the sort of lockdown period. So I can't imagine normally without understanding how much people would die from plane crashes. That's a lot. Okay, so going back to our concepts, you have to remember one thing because we just started talking about risk. When we talk about risk, we have both. We have the likelihood or the probability of an unforeseen event to happen. We're not sure, we don't know, but it might happen, perhaps because it happened before, perhaps because of the area, because of the context of where we are. And if it happens, that will have a certain impact. Now, the impact that it has or the consequence over a certain period of time, it could be related to a project, that will indicate the level of risk if a particular type of risk is more dangerous or riskier or it's less dangerous. And then you will take measures according to that. So now, according to PMBOK, how do we manage risk? Because we want to know, it's not just about knowing what's danger or what hazard will become a risk with some consequences or impact, but it's also about knowing if it happens, how would you deal with them? So according to PMBOK, we have 6 processes involved in managing risk, including you have to plan for how you would manage risk if they become a reality. You have to think about what sort of risk might affect your particular project. So you need to identify projects, risk-related projects. And you have to also do a qualitative risk analysis. So qualitative is about the practical step that you would take to overcome those risks. Quantitative is about how much the consequences or the impact will have, how much impact it will have on that project. So you have to quantify in terms of money and so on. And you have to plan for risk responses. So how would you deal with those particular risks and how would you control them? In general, when you work in an organization or you start working for the first time, you have a risk training, and these would involve those 4 well-known steps, that we know that they will talk to you about how you need to identify risk, how you need to assess risk, you need to plan for risk responses, and you have to track and control risk. So with the risk identification, it's all about looking at the sources, where it's coming from, the method, and when you talk about the assessment of that, it's assessing the likelihood. So how often this particular risk might happen, or was it going to happen or not? So it's also thinking about if it happened, what sort of impact it will have and what sort of consequences, and which one needs to be prioritized. And then you plan for risk responses, which means the strategies. You will hear about some of the risks you can accept, some of them you can sort of transfer, some of them you can avoid, and so on. So those are the 4 well-known risk management processes, but PMBOK has extended that to 6, where it talks about you have to plan for risk as well before you identify them. And also you have to track and control the responses. The assessment of the risk here is done with qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis as well. So now let's look into plan risk management. So normally, like I said before, every organization will have a standard risk management plan in place. So in that standard, they will talk to you, or they will have recorded the methodology, the tools, the data from which they normally use to assess the risk or to plan on how to manage a certain type of risk. They will also have responsibilities. Some of the risk will be the responsibility of the manager, some of them will be for lower employees, some of them will be for much more senior employees. So they will have the roles and responsibility of who will deal with certain risk. They will have mentioned a budget and resources allocated to deal with this type of risk, how often they do deal with them, so the timing, and also what sort of categories these will sit within. It could be external risk or it could be internal risk. We'll talk about that in further detail. And they will also have perhaps the stakeholder tolerances in terms of how they would manage or how they would manage the impact of those particular risks, and also the reporting format. So some of the risk that is not responsibility of the lower employees would have to be reported to the manager, for instance, and the manager will deal with that, and also the tracking of requirement for that. So in terms of planning the risk, all of most organizations have a risk management plan in place on how to plan for the next similar or potential risk. But there are other techniques that I use as well beside that risk management plan. So put yourself in this particular context of that story this week. So if you're particularly John, the project manager of an event company, and you have been engaged to run a large fundraising concert in Melbourne in the month of November. So this is actually a scenario that we've sort of examined for the semester. But John, in this sentence here, want to think about the risk. So unforeseen event that might affect that potential project of fundraising music concerts. It will look into the risk management plan that his organization has already in place, and he will try to identify which risks are likely to come back or to affect this type of project. Because in that risk management plan, they would have recorded past risk or the risk that have potential to happen in Melbourne in November. If you can think of some of them, what would have been some of the risk that might happen in November in Melbourne for a fundraising event? The most probable one that I could think of, because it's a fundraising event concert, and with Melbourne weather, you could think of extreme weather. Yes, you could think of extreme weather as one of the risks. So that would have been recorded in his organization risk management plan, and John would have come across that because it's very often. And if he works in an event management company, they will think about whether or not to have the event outside or indoor, and that is one of the risks why they would consider that particular thing. But it can also, even though it's recorded there, because it's a different time and it's a different project, it's a new project, John would have to brainstorm any other potential risk and their sources as well. And he will use the risk register to record those ones as well. Things have changed. Maybe when they've done the project in 2019, there was no pandemic. Now John has to think about other risk that is not recorded in the risk management plan. For instance, the COVID pandemic as well. If there was an outbreak, perhaps they want to do it online, some sort of way, find a way to do it remotely. So once you would do that, record this in a register, you will have to categorize those type of risk as well, which we'll do in the next slide. So this will be followed as well by qualitative risk analysis, because you want to know what sort of impact that potential risk will have, perhaps the pandemic as well. What sort of impact it will have. It will do a quantitative risk analysis as well. And it can use tools like SWOT analysis to do that. Has anyone heard of SWOT analysis? I think I mentioned that before.
Its strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats.
Yes. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities of threats of what's of the organization to deal with that particular risk. Is your company strong enough to deal with that? What are the weaknesses that your organization have to deal with that particular risk? So that is part of qualitative assessment risk as well. And obviously, it will plan on the responses based on those elements. So that puts you in the context of what we'll talk about next. So when we talk about risk identification, it's actually trying to find the sources of risk. Why? Because if you know the sources of risk, you also know how to deal with that particular risk. And if it comes back, you know where it will come and how it might affect your project along the line. So you have to think about any factors from all those unexpected or uncertain events that can potentially influence the outcome of the project. So you have to think about which risks are likely to affect the project and document them. The simple way to do that is using a brainstorming session or meeting with your project team. So you could sit down early on in the planning stage and think about what sort of unexpected event can happen and might potentially affect the project. Right now, they're actually planning for the Olympic in Beijing, if you notice that. And they're sort of planning the accommodation where the athletes will sit, and there is an outbreak, a very tiny outbreak, 12 people, I think, affected. I heard on the news today. So they're actually planning on how they will deal with that because we're actually in a time where there is a pandemic as well. One way would be to brainstorm what of the technique that could be put in place to sort of minimize the outbreak where the athlete will be staying, because some of the athletes are actually bringing some positive tests from their countries. So the government and the organizing body has to find a way to maintain or to contain this. Brainstorming is one easy way to do that. People sit down in a meeting and think about ways they could overcome that particular risk. But you have to remember that risk can be internal, so within the organization, and sometimes it's much easier to control or to deal with, but it could also be external. So that's actually beyond the organization, sometimes even outside of the project. And those type of risks are sometimes hard to control. So internal risk could include any technical, legal, managerial related risk. And sometimes it's risk of not fulfilling the requirements. Because, for example, someone is sick, can't be performing, you could find someone else to replace. So there seem to be some sort of risks that are easy to deal with. Sometimes it's just not trying to reach the time or the deadline. Sometimes it's the quality. So it's all related to the performance. Usually when we talk about internal risk, we look into performance of a particular employee or perhaps of some of the employees in the company. But then external risks are actually beyond the project team control in a way that it happened outside of the organization. This could include things like market condition, it could include suppliers, it could include regulations, weather, interest rates. Now we could even include a pandemic as well, because pandemic is sort of something that are outside of the project team organization. So usually you would have it right now. If we put ourselves back into that context of the Olympic, some of the athletes or even their families, they're coming from external country, they might bring some positive COVID test as well, which will be an external risk to the organizing committee. So another way to identify risk is to actually do a risk breakdown structure. So it's a little bit similar to a work breakdown structure, but you're looking into every category, could be technical, and trying to find where potential risk might come from. So it could be from the requirement, or it could be from the quality assurance, or it could be from the performance as well. Or you could break it down to an external group, trying to find out what sort of external area might generate potential risk. You could think about the weather if you're doing an event company or an event project. And you could think about the market condition. You can think about the regulations as well of the government regulations. That those things are external to your organization. Or you could do a group of organizational risk. So you think about your own organization, the resources, the fundings, even the performance. If you have employees there, are they performing? And you're trying to find out what sort of risk could come straight away from your organization, or just from the project itself. So you're just brainstorming the type of risk. So risk breakdown structure It's used, but it's not the sort of common standard like a WBS. So some people do use a risk breakdown structure. Some people do use brainstorming sessions and just record the risk. Some people will use SWOT analysis. Others will just use a risk register to record the risk. When we talk about project risk, we see a lot of sources of risk that are common to projects. There could be large investments, could be cash flows, sometimes with the procurement method that you're using. So the supplier or the supply chain has a problem, so that will be a risk related to the project. Sometimes it could be the inexperience of the stakeholders as well, or even your human resource. They don't have the appropriate skill to do the job. That's also a risk. It could be the environment is highly regulated, or it could be all the political and cultural sensitivity surrounding that particular project. So there are a lot of project risk. So risk related to the project, or sources of risk that are common that you could think of when you're actually trying to identify the risk. You could start brainstorming them and trying to see whether or not this would actually have an impact on your project. So I talked about the risk register. I said you can identify risk and trying to record them. The most common one, or the most easiest way to do that, is to use a risk register. So a risk register will look like perhaps a stakeholder register or communication register. But for the risk, you will have a risk ID. So you give a code or a number to a particular risk, and you have a description so that anyone that would have access to it will know exactly what sort of potential unforeseen event might happen and that might affect that particular project. The description could be changes cause budget overrun. So you could be precise with what sort of change that might cause budget overrun so people actually know exactly where the risk might happen. Let's say, for example, if you're getting funding from a bank and you can see the rate or the interest rates might go up because of economical issues, or you could say that it might be changing in agreement or contract or loan that may cause some sort of budget issue as well. So when you record it in the risk register, you have a clear description so that people know what exactly is the source of that risk. And then you have a column with a category. So if it's a financial risk related to budgets, you will record it as a financial risk. If it's related to the weather, for example, you record it as a environmental risk. So with the weather, you could give it a risk 002 underneath that, and then you say heavy storm may lead to flooding. Okay, so that description is very clear. People will know that this is an area where there's always heavy storm, and that heavy storm might cause flooding. And what sort of category that will be? Environment. Those three first columns must be very clear. The description has to have this root cause as well, or the source part as part of the description, so that the next person that is reading it know exactly where the risk might come from. I was talking to one of my old colleague that works in Madagascar now. With his has moved there with his family. We're talking about project, and he was telling me how the weather in Madagascar, the last project that he was involved, he had 14 days of rain non-stop. So from Monday to Sunday, only 14 days successfully raining every day for 14 days. So those are the type of risk that country has because of the weather in the rainy season. So they have very strong and long, heavy storm that could potentially lead to flooding as well. So that's the three first column. And then the other column of the risk register that we'll talk about in the next slide will involve the likelihood. So when that particular risk might happen, or if it's likely to happen, we'll look into a risk register or risk assessment matrix to see that, the consequence, and then the rating. So before we get that, these are part of the risk analysis. So you're doing your risk register, or you're filling your risk register as you're actually analyzing your risk as well. So you think about, first of all, what sort of risk might happen. So you have the description there, you have the category, and then the likelihood of that risk happening, the consequence if it happens, and the rating of that degree of risk. So that's likelihood, consequence, and rating is part of your risk analysis, which is the next step mentioned in PMBOK. So with your risk analysis, if you remember, there are two types of risk analysis. According to PMBOK, you will do a qualitative risk analysis and you will do a quantitative risk analysis. So the qualitative risk analysis is where you look at each individual risk, perhaps recorded in your register, and you evaluate the probability, the likelihood in one of that column, if you remember. And then you think about the impact and see what degree or the rating it will have to prioritize which one is bigger, so we have to deal with first, and which one is less or smaller risk. Like quantitative is more than that. It's just not prioritizing the bigger or the smaller, but it's also thinking about all of them combined, how much money or value dollar we will have to spend to overcome them. So it's about the money, but it's also about the numbers. More of those will cost more. Remember the plane crash and the car crash. If you put a year into that, you start counting how many car crash and how many plane crashes. That's actually quantitative analysis because you're thinking about the numbers and you're also thinking about the money involved into overcoming those risks. So with quantitative, sometimes it's not just counting them. Sometimes you have to use other methods. You have to use statistics. You have to use tables. You have to use a little bit of math or even some software to quantify the numbers or the quantity of that risk and to quantify the loss from the impact of that risk. So it's all about the value money, but also the quantity of that risk, regardless of the method that you'll be using to quantify them. But in terms of analyzing the risk, whether you're doing a qualitative or quantitative, particularly for quantitative, you will have to do an evaluation of risk, and you also have to do an evaluation of when all of them happen, because you're looking at combined numbers of them. What will be the project outcome, or what will be the outcome? This is actually not just for quantitative, even for qualitative as well. When you're recording them into the risk register, you will have a picture of the probability, the likelihood of that particular risk happening, the impact they will have, and the degree of that. But that will also give you an idea of what could be the possible project outcome, because in the next column of the risk register, you will have the mitigation. So how would you deal with that? So with risk, we think about factors as what would be the opportunities and threats. Remember, in the SWOT analysis, you will also think about whether a single event can actually cause multiple effects, which we call residual risk. For example, heavy storm is a risk on its own. If you have an event outside, you don't have a cover or anything to a tent, right in the middle it starts pouring rain. That's something that might affect that particular project. But then this could actually lead to flooding, and that's a residual risk. So multiple effects that come from one single risk. You have to think about those as well. But in quantitative, you quantify them and you're trying to find the overall impact and assess how you will deal with financially with them. But for qualitative, it's more about what are the practical steps that your organization would take to overcome them. That obviously would involve also money along the way. So sometimes qualitative and quantitative are performed at the same time. I talked about the SWOT analysis already, where you're examining the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats. Strength of your organization, opportunities of your organization to deal with that. Some of the time is the weaknesses and threats related to those elements as well. In your assignment, where you're not particularly required to do that, a simple risk register where you're recording the risk, thinking about the likelihood, the impact, the rating and the mitigation and so on will be enough. But you have to remember that most organizations would also use a SWOT analysis just to know how good or what are their potential to deal with that particular risk if it affects their project, what sort of resources they have in place to deal with that. So now back with the risk register. Yeah, I will give you a risk assessment example in the next slide to the risk register. Because with the risk register here, you need to assess your risk. You need to assess, when we say assessing the risk, we mean think about the likelihood, the consequence or the impact, and how strong or how high that risk is. So with the likelihood and the impact or the consequence, normally it's a set figure. The likelihood has already been developed by years of research. So they come up with a risk matrix. So you can use a risk matrix to think about what sort of likelihood and the consequence a risk will have. So you can tell here that the likelihoods have a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being rare. So the question is, what is the likelihood of that particular risk of happening or occurring? So if it's rare, that's a 1 score. If it's unlikely to happen, that particular risk, that's a 2. Moderate means that it might sort of happen, and that's 3. Likely means it will happen, that's 4. Almost certain, so definitely happening, that's 5. So from 1 to 5, that's likelihood. Likelihood means the probability of that risk or unforeseen event happening. Now, if it happens, remember the risk is not just the probability of it happening, because that would just be a danger or a hazard. But we want to know as well what sort of impact or consequence it will have on the project. So that also is rated from 1 to 5 in the risk matrix. So the risk matrix is universal. If you Google risk matrix, it's the same scale that is used commonly or everywhere in projects, regardless of the type of project that you're using. So now for the consequence, it's how severe that particular risk would be if it occur. So you might have a risk that if it occur, the consequence or the impact will be insignificant. So that's 1. Or the consequence or impacts are minor. That's 2. Or perhaps they are significant, so we can feel them. So that's 3. They're major, so they're huge. That's 4. They're severe, so really beyond our control. And that's 5. So it goes from 1 to 5, 1 being insignificant, 2 being minor, 3 being significant, 4 being major, and 5 being severe. Now, the risk register, we want you to do more. It's not just finding the likelihood or the probability of that risk happening and their impact, but it's also trying to find out which one is worse than the other. So which one is riskier, the degree of risk or the rating. And that's what you have here in the last column of that register. It doesn't stop there, but for now, that's the rating. So to find out the rating, you go back to the risk matrix again. What you do is you time the likelihood with the consequence. So the likelihood times the consequence of the impact. That will give you the risk score. What sort of project are you talking about? If we're talking about events, you will have in Melbourne, heavy storm, for example. So what other project do you have? We talked about, if you remember in the previous slides, we have common example here, large investment, we have technological system, we have procurement methods. So those are the sources of risk or the common types of risk you can have in projects. Now, depending on the project that you're referring to or you're working on, there will be specific risk that you have to brainstorm as part of the project team. So in regard to tech industry, you do have, for example, still the performance of people. You might even have the software issues as well as risk. It will depend on the project. You might have the stakeholders being involved in the risk as well. There is always time-related risk. So with meeting the deadline, there's always budget-related risk. Those are risks that affect any type of project. It doesn't have to be tech. So there are a lot of risks that you can brainstorm. And you can brainstorm, you can even search as well online. You will have a lot of risks depending on the type of project that you're doing as well. Are you doing the case study of the Volkswagen case study?
Yes, I am, and I'm trying to think from the angle of my case study, like how we going to work on our assessment. So because I'm just not being
So that's assessment tree. Have you found anything so far?
no,
Because the
not
urgent news, yeah, the urgent news that are provided for each case study actually have the risk mentioned in there, or gives you an idea of the type of risk that you have to deal with. I'll come back to assignment tree after we finish the class because yeah, the risks are actually mentioned in the urgent news, and you can actually your assignment tree would be you to find to do a risk assessment and a change control. So you can brainstorm the risk based on the urgent news that you'll be provided. That will give you a sort of a direction of which sort of risk is mentioned here that you have to deal with, and then you have to record it in your register and then assess that for your assignment tree. I'll get back to you in regard to that. So now moving forward, the likelihood, as I said, will come from the risk register. So you have to look into that risk. What is the likelihood of it or the probability of it happening? You're looking at your context of your project, when your project is happening, where it's happening, how it's being set up, what sort of unforeseen event might happen. And when you think about then, what is the likelihood of happening in that particular context? If it's likely or almost certain or even moderate, what sort of consequence would it would it have? Would it be insignificant? Would it be minor? Would it be significant, major, or severe? So once you, let's say, if we put ourselves in the context of that fundraising project happening in Melbourne in November. So we talked about heavy storm being one of the risks. Let's rate it. Let's find its likelihood. What is the likelihood of having heavy storm in Melbourne in November? I don't know, say 4, likely. Rachel say medium. Can we use the scale of likelihood from 1 to 5, 1 being rare, 2 unlikely, 3 moderate, 4 likely, and 5 almost certain. Okay, so we agree that it's likely. So it's likely in November that we might have heavy storm in Melbourne. Just in that same context of that project, if heavy storm happen in Melbourne and you're having that event outside, what would be the impact or the consequence from 1 to 5? Would that be insignificant? Would that be minor? Would that be significant? Would that be major? Or would that be severe? 4, anyone else say? So major. And John say anything is possible in Melbourne with weather. Yes. So we might have major consequence because people will be wet if we're having it outside. Okay. Now we want to see the degree of that risk, if it's a high risk or it's a low risk. So you have to take the likelihood. We say the likelihood was likely, so 4. And we say the consequence is major, which is 4. So 4 times 4 give us 16. And if you look into the risk matrix here, 16 falls within the very high. So that risk is very high. And that's what the rating is. If you fill the risk register, you will have very, very high. So now, if the event was indoor, okay, we already found out that it's likely that in November there will be heavy storm. So that's 4, the likelihood. What would be the consequence of that if you are having the fundraising event indoor? Or in a tent, for example? What would be the consequence?
If it's going to be indoors, then it'll be low.
Yeah, so the consequence for us, we use the scale from 1 to 5 here, and we might put it as minor as 2. So now if this is minor, we want to find the degree of risk. We'll take the 4 likely times 2 minor, that gives us 8. So that risk is considered as medium. So in the risk register here, it helps you to rate the risk. You will have some risks that are low, some that are medium, some that are high, and then some are very high and extreme. So you might not worry too much about the very low risk or the low risk, but you have to think about the medium, the high, the very high, and the extreme to see whether or not you have the resources or the response to deal with, which we'll talk about in the later stage. So just bear in mind that for the risk assessment, it includes, yes, you need a risk register for assignment 3 to show your risk assessment. So for your assessment, you will have to have a risk register, and that risk register will have a column of obviously the risk ID. It will have the risk description. It will also have the category of that risk, the likelihood, which will come from the risk assessment. Okay, so you don't have to come up with a new likelihood. You can just use the scale provided here with this description. And the consequence as well will come from the risk matrix, and the rating will come from the risk matrix as well. Okay, so I'll talk about assignment 3 later, but you will actually submit a video. But that video, the link to the video will be included in a PowerPoint because it's a presentation. So you have a PowerPoint with the risk register included in there, and the link to your video provided in the PowerPoint. There is no video submission on Canvas, and you submit the PowerPoint. So when I open the PowerPoint, I'll click on the link. I'll be able to listen to your recording and then mark your assignments. And obviously, any information that is provided in the PowerPoint side as well will be something that will support. If you don't have enough minutes or enough time, you can always say refer to the risk management so that I can actually see what you provided. So this is an example of a risk register. You do have here the risk and the ID 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7 and 8. And then they have the likelihood here. That likelihood come from the risk assessment matrix. You have the impact or the consequence from the risk assessment matrix. And the exposure here is the rates. It's also the degree of risk. So it's the likelihood times the impact or consequence. And then you have the actions, which we haven't talked about yet, but this is the next few slides. We talk about the actions or the mitigation measure, and also the indicators that will have to be included as well. I will explain that in the next slide. So now you have these activities on risk, and there is scenario of risk register. And here I was talking about risk that you have identified earlier, which is with that scenario of event management, which we have done. We talked about the heavy storm. We found out the likelihood. We found out the consequence if the event is outside, and we also find out the likelihood and consequence if the event is indoor, and also the consequence or the rating of that. So I'll give you a 5 minutes break. We will look into the next part of the risk response and what sort of mitigation measure you can take. These are the last column that will need to be included in your risk register. And then after this, I will talk about change control and then finalize it with the assignment 3. Okay, so we have 5 minutes break. Okay, so I'm not sure if it's 5 minutes yet, but yeah. There was an ambulance in the back. Just remind me of the district where I used to live now. Okay, so so okay, so if you look at this sort of a cartoon shown there, and it's quite funny because I found it in one of those project managements. It's supposed to be a joke, but as you can tell here, I'm just trying to move this slide. My screen is a bit frozen. It says our risk management software says your idea is too risky. So you probably have a meeting between the project management team and the client, and as usual, the clients have added a feature in the project or wanted something a little bit more, and the project manager is trying to let the client know that the idea is a bit too risky, and the client obviously sees it as a client point of view, thinks it's much easier to deal with, just trying to reduce one of the inputs, perhaps one of the products, instead of doing 5 or 4, can you just produce 4? And then it's asking which one. And I said honesty. So it's actually showing you that from the point of view of the client, they might actually think that it's easy for you as the project team to deal with risk and overcome it. But same time, you have to let them know if they're asking you to change features, to add features, that this is not, you don't just reduce features in your projects, but it takes a lot more just to deal with risk. And that's what we'll talk about in the next slide. So with risk responses, according to PM Book, if you look at the stages, step 5 is to plan for risk responses. So planning for it is pretty much thinking about what you're going to do to deal with that particular risk. You already brainstorm what potential risk might happen in your project, brainstorm the likelihood and consequences that they might have, and which one would be riskier or stronger. Now you have to think about what sort of responses you will have or what ways or approach you will use to deal with them. So normally in general, we have 3 main categories of responses. If the risk is pretty low or very low, you could actually decide to avoid that risk. So you can, if you can try to avoid the risk. You're using perhaps technologies or methods that will actually make sure that those risks are completely out of the picture. Or another way would be to mitigate. Mitigations means to reduce the impact or perhaps to deflect. Perhaps you know that if there might be any issue with your procurement, you want to have a fixed price contract so that if the market condition changes, that won't affect your project. So that's risk, financial risk will be reduced or will be mitigated. So sometimes you need to transfer it as well. So using another way, let's say you're thinking about instead of using that particular supplier that lives quite in a different state, I might use a local supplier, for example, that will sort of avoid or make sure that I reduce the potential risk of having the to deal with financial issue of or having to deal with that supplier. Some risks are risks that you can't overcome. So you have to think about either accepting it, so there's nothing else you can do about it, it's there, or you need to share it. You can use contingency plan to recover or absorb the impact. So they are unavoidable. For example, you can stop the rain really. You have to pretty much accept it, but you can actually mitigate their impact. So find a way that if it happened, it would doesn't have it wouldn't have a stronger impact or bigger consequences on your project because it's unavoidable. And trying to form perhaps way or find ways that you could share the impacts with other stakeholders as well, so they know that this is happening and this will be the impact, especially the client and the sponsor. So with that planning of risk responses, the result of it comes back to how you identify it. So the result of identification, the result of the analysis will actually guide the responses as well. And sometimes the responses can be found in previous documentation if your company have documented it. And that's why it's actually useful to have your risk documented in a risk register, because the next project that would be similar would probably have this as a heads up of risks to avoid, risk to mitigate, or risk to accept as well. You will know how to deal with them. When the risk management plan is set out or developed, you would have included strategies or responses that would have the either avoidance, mitigation, or deflection, or perhaps acceptance. And also, the management plan would also have the costs involved in all of those responses. The cost is not included in the risk register, but the cost will be included in the risk management plan. And that risk management plan would have the cost because you would have done a quantitative risk analysis as well. So now in the risk register and the risk management plan, you also have the responsibility of the person or the department that is assigned to deal with that particular risk. And that would have to be included as well. So if it's a legal risk, perhaps you have the legal team that would have to deal with that. If it's financial risk, you might have the financial team that would have to deal with that, and so on. So it would also So it comes down to documenting the risk after you assess it and after you have thought about the responses. We did mention about contingency when you know that the risk is unavoidable and you can't actually overcome the risk. So the only way is to accept it by to try to lessen the impact of that risk. You could use your contingency, which means plan A, plan B, plan C, for example, to find out or to cover for the impact of that particular risk. So if you have a contingency budget, you might think of whether or not using that. If you have a backup plan or contingency plan B, plan C, you might think about how to use that to overcome or to lessen the impact of that particular risk. It says the more contingency plan you have in the plan, the greater likelihood that the commitment you make to stakeholder will come true. So having an extra plan will save you of sort of overcoming risk to commit to what you have agreed with other stakeholder. But it has a lot of advantage. You would have way to track if you record your risk. You have way to overcome that risk as well. More importantly, beyond your contingency plan or the responses that you have to think about whether or not those responses will be useful enough to avoid any resulting effect of that risk. I did mention that earlier. I talked about the residual risk. So the responses that you provide has to also think about the residual risk. If you're thinking about using tents, for example, to overcome heavy storm in November in Melbourne for that events management fundraising project. You might also think about whether or not the tent will be sufficient to overcome flooding if there are any flooding, because there are risks that have residual risk of further consequences. And your response has to gather for the residual risk, but also to overcome the residual risk as well. And with the residual risk, you might go through an assessment as well, the same way that we did for the main risk. So for flooding, you might have to go through the risk assessment impact and trying to find, for example, what would be the likelihood or the consequences and the rating of flooding if it happened for that particular project. But this is actually done after you have thought about the mitigation measure or the responses to the main risk. You have to do another assessment for the residual risk, and this will all be included in your risk register. So your risk register will have the columns mentioned earlier, the 6 earlier columns, and then you will have to add a mitigation measure column, and then you have to add 3 columns for the residual risk. It will depend on the risk. Some of the risk won't have any residual risk, but some will have further risk that might actually be derived from that risk. So you have to assess those further risks as well. You have to think about who will be responsible or the department that will be responsible. And the indicators here are actually the signs that that risk will be happening or is about to happen or is starting to happen. So for example, the indicator for heavy storm in November for a fundraising event project would probably be the weather forecast. Because you could say that in November in Melbourne, we do have heavy rain because the weather forecast is actually talking about heavy rain. So that will be an indicator or a sign that there will be heavy rain. And that can be included for that particular risk. Any questions so far? Okay, so that being said, once you have thought about the responses and also thought about the residual risk, you have to think about how you will control the risk. So this is the last step involved in PMBOK. So the controlling is actually making sure that the risk is not impending on the project during the time the project is happening. So you're controlling the response that you have put in place. If you're using contingency plans, controlling the contingency budget that you're using. If you're using, let's say, you have a backup plan in case you were thinking of having the event outside. Now you do have a backup plan of moving people inside, and it's actually the project is happening and there is rain. You're actually making sure that the transition from outside to inside or indoor is actually being done properly. So you're controlling that risk management during that step of the project. So it's actually when the project is happening and when the risk is being controlled that you make sure that it's actually following the mitigation measure or the responses that you have put in place. So with controlling the risk, it's all about monitoring, it's all about communicating what's communicating the responses. So you would have come with a mitigation measure of responses. You will have a plan on how to implement it, and you have to monitor that it's being implemented effectively during the project, and you have to communicate with your stakeholder throughout all those steps. So in summary, we know the core steps involving risk. It's identifying, assessing, and responding. That's the common steps. But with PMBOK, with the management of projects, you have to think about assessing those risks, including the likelihood, the consequences, and the rating of those risks. And all of this will be recorded in a risk register. And some company use the 1 to 5 scales risk matrix. Some of them actually already have a way to sort of put them. You will notice most companies will have risk matrix already embedded in their risk management plan, and you will use that to just categorize the risk and put the risk into the common mitigation measure as well. But for all the risks, there are warning signs where you need to know when the risk is likely to happen. And those warning signs will help you to monitor the risk as well along the line. You will have a risk analysis and change control procedure, which we'll talk about next, which actually will actually guide the way the risk is implemented. There are a lot of readings on risk assessment and also decisions on how to deal with risk, whether it's qualitative or quantitative as well. Any questions so far? Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is include the change control. It's like 4 or 5 slides only, not much. And that will be pretty much the last element that you need to know for your assignment 3. So change control is actually related to risk. So you know for a fact that a unforeseen event is likely to happen. What will be the consequence of it and how you will respond to it? What are the signs and so on from your risk register? And now the reality is that unforeseen event happen and you need to respond to it. So you respond to it, but you will implement some changes in your project as well. So there is a whole process of how you control the change from that particular risk and also how the change is implemented, which we call change control. So in this particular slide here, it's pretty much integration change control. I'm talking about integration because this is actually the first thing that comes in mind when you talk about the projects, how all the knowledge area that we spoke about throughout this semester work together or integrate together. And also, when you know how they integrate together, then you will know how easily you can implement the change. If a change cost is happening, how would that affect the time? And how would that affect procurement? If a change in time is happening, how would that affect procurement? And how would that affect the relationship with the stakeholder as well? David is asking, this is week 10, right? This is actually a combination of week 10 and week 9. Yeah, so this is week 10. So with integration is how the projects are evaluated, series of actions that are taking place when you're closing the project and also while you're implementing any changes. And sometimes is also the value of lesson learned for projects. So normally you would have those knowledge area of PM bug. But integration is actually the first one, it's not the last. We see it as the last because you have to understand the others before you see how they all integrate together or they all work together. So with integration, you would start with developing a project charter. So it's early on when you start actually after your initiating phase, after meeting your client and sponsor, you'll think about developing a charter. That's when you think about how all the knowledge area that we study integrate together. And also, when you move on to the planning stage, also you think about how they integrate together when you develop a project management plan. And during the executing and monitoring stage, you also think about how projects integrate together. So how the knowledge area, cost, time, stakeholder, all of that work together. And during the time when you're actually implementing change, let's say there is a risk, something unfortunate happened and impacted the project, you change few things in your project. When you implement the change, you still think about how they integrate together. And when you finalizing your project, you think about how they integrate together. So integration is actually the first thing you think about when you're working on a project, how everything comes together and how one affects the other. And you think about that towards your entire project, even within those 6 processes. So you will see, for example, that you would remember when we started in week 2, we talked about scope. We said scope is about the work that is involved. And everything that is outside, you still have to know the out of scope, but you have to focus on the in scope. So the work involved has certain steps on how to manage it. If you remember, we talked about you have to develop a WBS. You have to think about list of deliverables. You have to think about the list of milestones. Milestones are stages. Deliverables are activity tasks. And also you have to think about any technical requirements, so standards and all of that. With the scope, we thought about how you have to have smart objectives. And we've talked about how you also need to have the list of requirements from your stakeholder, to think about the constraints, and the constraints were defined in scope statement. You would actually talk about what is involved within what type of time frame, and also budget. So you have to think about the constraints as well when you write your scope statement. So that was with scope. And then we talked about cost. And with cost and time, we look into what is involved in managing the budget for costs and what is involved in managing the time. For the time, we look into obviously the WBS that you would have, the milestone, because you have the stages that come with a certain level of time involved in that. You think about the activities that you have developed in your WBS, how it works into a sequence, which one comes first and which one will come after. And this is through a network diagram that you would have developed. And with that network diagram, it will tell you which one is the critical path, because the critical path are the path where all the critical activities are located in, and also the longest path. If it's affected, the entire project will be affected. So you would think about that. And also you would think about sort of technique that you will use to allocate the duration for each activity. Perhaps you want to present it in a Gantt chart where you would have the list of your activity from your WBS with the code, the starting and the finish dates, and you also have the sequence of how which activity will come first. And in this particular course, we didn't focus on the leads and lags, which is pretty much when two activities are running around the same time and how you calculate those little lapse of time. We didn't do all of that, but we just focus on the Gantt chart and the network activity and the technique used to allocate the duration as well. For the cost, we thought about, if you remember, the direct costs, indirect costs as well. And we talked about the method that you use, top-down, bottom-up approach to allocate the budget. And we talked about the fact that production costs, which include direct and indirect costs, is not enough. You have to think about contingency because obviously of risk. You need to think about those elements of a backup money on the side in case something unexpected occur, which is always the case in a project. And also having a profit cost. That will help you if you run out of your contingency, but it also helps with maintenance costs afterward that you have to think about when it comes to your cost. And then we talked about stakeholders, so the individuals that actually affect or can be affected by the project, how you need to manage the level of engagement, especially if they have high power and high interest, how you need to manage them. Perhaps we talked about recording those key information about the stakeholder in a stakeholder register where you have the stakeholder ID, the contact details, what are the requirements, what they bring in the project, and what they expect out of the project when they come in the project in lifetime, if they're external or internal, and what sort of influence they will have in the project. We talked about communicating with them, how you manage communication between them, perhaps better record it as well, of the what's, the when, and the how the information are shared across stakeholders to manage the level of engagement. And then we talked about, if you remember, we talked about the procurement. Procurement is actually getting or acquiring resources from an outside organization to come in. But before we think about acquiring resources outside, we need to do an analysis of a make or buy, whether or not we can't do it indoor. If we can do it indoor or in-house in our own organization, we don't need to go outside. But if we can't have those resources in-house, we need to outsource it. And that's through a procurement. You have to think about how you would advertise a job, what sort of tender you will use, and what sort of response you will get as well. And in the format of the response, you have to find a way to evaluate how you will select the response as well. You won't need to evaluate the response if you're using a company that you worked before, one company, you just go with them. But once you evaluate the response, you have to think about the sort of contract that you will have between those company, between you and them as well. the legal binding document, and for what sort of work, the statement of work. What will be their responsibility when they come in, and what sort of money you might pay them, and how long they might do the job for you. So costs and time will have to be taken into consideration when you're doing procurement as well. And then we talked about human resources, using your own resources within your organization to do the job as well. Perhaps you could move your resources from one department to another, or perhaps you could hire someone to come in to work in the project and stay in your organization. So we talked about the stages of team building of TACMAN 5 model of when it goes to norming, storming, and all of that, and how a manager should be able to recognize which stages his team is facing and how to deal with them with team activities and so on. Sometimes team members are like cats, and what sort of technique you could use the same way that you would use to deal with different personality that a cat has. And then we talked about how to deal with unexpected event that we call risk, which we just saw now, and how to deal with risk management. Perhaps you want to identify the risk, and then you want to assess the risk, do a qualitative assessment through finding the likelihood and the consequences of the risk and perhaps the degree of risk as well. You will record or capture this in a risk register where you will include the responses as well, what sort of responses you will have or mitigation measure that you will have, who will be responsible, and also what sort of sign or indicators will tell you that this risk is happening. Some risk will have further consequences, which will call residual risk, and you would have to include that in your risk register as well, and you have to assess those residual risk as well. So now with integration, all of those knowledge area, they are linked together. If you have a problem with your budget, it might affect the procurement, it might affect the the time, because if you don't pay certain workers, they might not do the job as well. So that will put the project behind schedule. But look again with this circle here. Is there any of the knowledge area that you think are not linked together or they're not integrated with the other? Some of those elements. We didn't talk about quality. Quality is also one of the knowledge area, but there is a whole specific course in our program in RMIT for quality. And we were told in other courses not to cover quality because there is a whole course on that that's actually quite well detailed. So that wasn't mentioned in this course, but it's one of the knowledge area as well. So forget about quality, but think about the others that we have talked about. Do you think they're all linked, or do you think that some of them are not necessarily linked? And which one do you think are not necessarily linked in the project? Okay, so usually they're all linked. Somehow one would affect the other. Exactly. So thanks, Eleanor. So if a stakeholder is not happy the way, let's say the clients or the sponsor have a problem with the way you manage a project, they may not provide the necessary fundings, or they may provide decisions that might affect the project, which might actually result in risk, that could result in delay, that could result in cost. So they're all linked within each other, even quality as well. And one issue with one of the knowledge area might result in issue with others. That's why you see them as an integrated block or integrated circle when you start a project and you started to look into each individual separately as you go as well. But more importantly, most projects, like I said, will never go 100%. They will always have risk. But with risk come changes to overcome those risks because of the responses that we choose to overcome a particular risk. So with changes, you have to do that before you complete the project. And changes come some suddenly in the form, it could come from in the form of a new information or a design change. It could be from the client, could be from the sponsor, it could be from the contractor, from any of the stakeholders, internal or external, that are involved in the project. But normally, what companies do is acknowledge the change, record it, and approve or reject it. You have to acknowledge where the change is coming from. Why? Remember, some stakeholders can have the power to affect the project. Some don't even have power. So if you have someone that have low power, low interest requesting a change, you will probably not implement the change. So you need to acknowledge where the change is coming from. But if it's someone with high power, high interest requesting the change, you will have no choice than implementing it or perhaps talk about the change. So you need to acknowledge where it's coming from and you need to record it. It's good to record because people change their minds and you don't want a client to come back to the change or the mind and say, we never said that, or we didn't mean it that way, or we didn't actually want it this specific way. So it's good to record it so you have a trace of the change. Perhaps when you record it, which I will show you in the next slide, you have them sign an approval to show that they actually acknowledge that they made the request of that particular change. In case they come back later on and sort of refute the change, you will have a proof of that. Change needs to be managed. You can't just take a change and implement it because some of the changes would probably be beneficial because you add value for money, will probably reduce time, so they will be beneficial. If you will remember the triple constraint iron triangle, but some of them will be compatible with the project deliverables. Perhaps it's something that was missing and then you added it, all makes sense. Some of them will have to be confirmed in terms of cost, time, and quality. Some of them will have to be approved. Some of them will have to be completed to an agri standard. So some of the changes actually chance for betterment of the project, but not always. Some of them will come with issues that would actually affect the project. So there is certain processes that are put in place by company on how to implement changes. You have to think about whether or not the changes will have to be included in all the management of procurement management, cost management, all those knowledge areas as well. So there has to be a certain process in place where you can implement the change. And also there must be an approval point. So someone within the project team that is the approval person to that change. Could be the project manager, could be the project control board, could be the financial administration, depending on the change. There has to be an approval mechanism of the right person or the right group that are there to approve that particular change. So, like I said before, if you look at the circle of all the knowledge area, you will notice that one change in one knowledge area can actually affect the other knowledge area as well. This is why the project manager will need to trace how the changes might affect the other knowledge area. And that's why some companies use a change log or a change control register, which is a document where you include the person requesting the change, when the change is being requested, what sort of change is being requested, and also the impact that that change would have, perhaps on the cost and the time as well of the project. According to, if you look at the little circle on top there, if I zoom in, this is actually the change management process that most companies follow. So there is a request for change, and then there is an impact analysis whether or not the change will benefit the project or will actually impede the project. If it will benefit the project a certain way or it's something that can be done, there will be an approval process that will go through the approval person group that is the approval point. Or if it's a change that would actually negatively impact the project, there will be a reject or denial of that change. But if it's approved, the next stage will be to implement the change and then to review the change and to report the change as well. The reason why the changes are reviewed for all the parties or stakeholders to to agree with the way the change has been implemented and the reason why it's reported. Because if the next project comes along and there is a similar type of change needed, they will know how to implement it as well. We would have noticed that most of the things in the projects are recorded because companies tend to do similar projects and they want to make sure that they know how to deal with those particular changes. So, for example, in this activity here, if you have a scenario where the client has requested the following changes to the building scope, so you have a building that was went along, you're actually in executing stage, you're doing things, but then the clients want an additional level to the building. So it wanted to be from 2 to 3 level, and it's happy to add a cost of 2 million. So the scope is being changed here. And they want a coffee machine in the kitchen for the staff. That is 3,500. And they want an additional landscape to improve the way that building entrance will look like. So they're requested for 5,000. So that's for the overall appearance of the building. So one of the ways to do it would be to capture those change requests. So you have an ID or a request number. You will have the description of the change provided in the column there and the proposer of the change. So who is asking for the change? It's good to know who is actually requesting because I said again, some stakeholders have low interest and low power. So you don't really need to, you can decide whether or not to implement the change. But if it's high power, high interest, then you don't have a choice. So the proposer of the change will have to be recorded as well. And then the submission date, so when the change is being asked, and the reviewer. So the reviewer will be someone from the project team, someone with experience and expertise to know whether or not it's feasible. Can we add an additional landscape there by the way things look? Can we add one level above what we already have? Because that's a big ask and that's a big change in scope. Coffee machine, perhaps it's not a big issue. You can buy a coffee machine and put it there. But some of the changes are huge changes and will need to be assessed or reviewed whether or not they're feasible or they can be done. And the reviewer would also have a date allocated, so a time. It's important to have a time of the review because by the time the change is requested, things would have changed by the time the assessment is done to see whether or not it can be implemented. Rules and regulation might have changed. The market condition economically might have changed as well. So perhaps the money that the clients have proposed to pay, let's say they have said that we'll add 2 million for the additional level of the building. We'll pay 5,000 for the landscape and 3,500 for the coffee machine in that floor. So by the time the review or the assessment would have been completed, perhaps the coffee machine will be cheaper, or perhaps you will have laws and regulation that will make the landscape and one level above more expensive. So you have to go back with to this client to request for more money or additional scope, or perhaps negotiate on the change. So the review date has to be included as well. And then there is the authorizer. So who's the person who authorizes the change? Those changes would involve a lot of financial inputs and also would involve an additional time, we say additional cost, I've already said that, but also would involve also, a lot of changes in procurement and so on. So the authorizer has to be a senior person, or a person that who approve the budget. Sponsor will have to say yes, we're willing to approve that, in obviously consultation with the project team. If it's feasible, they would approve it to pay for it. And the approval date has to be recorded as well. And the approval statutes, by the time it has been approved, maybe the project hasn't been started yet or the implementation hasn't been started of the change, and also any further additional statutes of the project as well. So that change control log or change control register will have to be implemented or recorded for any changes that has been or will be asked by the client or any stakeholder as well. So normally there is no format of how the changes are implemented, either of how the projects are closed. But once you have implemented all the changes, you have to make sure that everything has been done according to what has been agreed by all the parties. And obviously, you have to think about closing your project if you have finalized everything. There's no format, every organization has their own way of doing it. But there is always an evaluation of whether or not the product or the work has been done to the standard or the quality that was needed by the client. So with the evaluation recognizes the constraints, which means the cost and time, including the scope as well. What sort of work was involved, whether or not the project was or the product was underachieved, so the quality is poor, or it's overachieved, so you achieve the goals, and along with all the changes that have been implemented. With the closing, you will have to release all the resources. We're talking about people that come to work as part of your procurement will have to be let go or finalized. The contracts to be finalized. You will have to release the resources as well that you probably have borrowed. You have to go. The contract will have to be closed with the supplier. You have closing activities that will involve stakeholders as well, and the stakeholder will have to give their acceptance or approval if they're happy with the services and the product that you have delivered. There will be a verification of all the deliverables, making sure that they have been completed and the milestones as well. And there will be final presentations, sometimes final meetings where all the parties will discuss how things are done. Quality assurance check will be done as well to physically make sure that the product has been finalized. And also there is a part of lesson learned that is captured as well. Because companies, like I said, tend to do the same projects, or even clients as well want to work with the same sort of projects in the future. So they want to capture the lesson learned as well to improve future projects. So normally there is a formal step involved in closing a project. It's formal because if it's not done properly, you might have issue with the client that could even lead to court cases as well. So you have to do a formal closing of the project where you're closing all the phases and making sure that all the issues are finalized, all the administrative requirements are done, all the documents have been fulfilled or filled, and also if there is any sort of post-mortem that has been done in terms of the project. So when you close a project, you think about integration because all of the knowledge are integrated. That this product, the services, it's taken into consideration every element that needs to be taken into consideration in the project. If there was an additional service or product that resulted from what you have done, you have to look into the transition from that project to the new addition. And sometimes there is also an extension. So some projects end because it was successfully achieved. The goal have been achieved. So there is no transition to an additional service, but it's just terminated there. And sometimes projects are sudden ends, and that sudden ends may actually be because of starvation. So you don't have any funding, and there is withdrawals of stakeholders. So the project is completed. So we covered none of the 10 knowledge areas except for quality, and we've seen how all of them integrate together. And if there is any risk or changes, there will be a change that need to be applied. So this is the final material for this particular course. Next week there will be a review of other methodologies that are involved. But when it comes to your assignment tree, that's all you needed to include for your assignment tree. So how many of you can you hear me? David can't hear me. Rachel can hear me. Okay. Okay, so how many of you are have sort of finalized assignment 2 or 2B? Any question on that? Any question on assignment 2B? Okay, so I'm assuming everyone is okay with that. And what about, I didn't want to talk about assignment 3 yet, but I will have to. What about assignment 3? Has anyone started assignment 3? Okay, some people have started reading out. Okay, so here's the thing, for those who haven't started yet, just to give you a sort of a heads up, if you go to assignments, assignment 3 has been released, you would have seen assignment 3. Okay, so now let's just sort of give you an overview of assignment 3. So assignment 3 is a video recording. I insist on the word video. The reason why I say video is some of you, I wouldn't have seen you for the entire term, and I don't even, to be honest with you, I don't know how you look like, which means that if I see you in Melbourne, we can pass each other, I will know it's you. So that's why assignment 3 is purposefully being done as a video recording, not a voice recording. I would say you don't have to find yourself in a fancy place to record yourself, okay? You can use any sort of background. It doesn't matter. You're not being marked on the background. You just have to see you as you appearing in the video. Okay, apparently my sound is going in and out. This is actually, I think it's my computer. I don't think it has, okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm not sure what's going on with my computer, but I don't think it's the internet. So I'm gonna say that again. Assignment 3 is a video recording. It's not a voice recording. Just bear that in mind. But this is the only opportunity that I will have to see all of you and know how you look like. And I've done that in purpose to make sure that it's a video recording. Now, how do you record yourself? That's actually for you to decide. You can use your phone to record yourself. You can use your computer, or you can use Studio. So you would have the Studio here, okay? I hope you can see the screen here. So when you look at Studio, you click on Studio on your canvas. It's actually a window where you can actually record yourself. If you look here, there is a recording button, and yeah, PowerPoint has also option to record. But remember, PowerPoint has a tendency to do voice recording, but in your assignment, it's a video recording. So trying to find the video recording option of PowerPoint, not the voice recording. Okay. So the only advantage of Studio here is the fact that it will always stay on your Canvas shell, which means that if you you record yourself, it will be saved here. It won't go anywhere else. So you will be your computer and you record yourself there. And if you want to share the link, then you would have to perhaps click on that three button here. It will say share the link, and then you copy the link. So ultimately, what the format is a PowerPoint slide, and on your first PowerPoint slide, you would share the link to your video recording. Video recording of what? It's a 5 minutes video recording, okay, of risk and management of the change control. The risk will come from your urgent news, okay? Yes, you have to work on risk management and change control. I think that's what, yes, have it presented, as Umar is saying. Okay, David say I don't have studio on my canvas. Same. Okay, so that's a little bit weird. But in the past, student has studio as well, unless they have actually, because that's a setting that has nothing to do with the instructor. That has been set up like this. So if you don't have studio, what about here? I mean, look at your account name, go down to this. Do you have that? Studio here. Can you check that far left column? Yes, okay. So that's where it appears as well. If you don't see the studio here, you can see studio here. Okay, so you can find studio here. It's the same studio, if I put it that way. So that's how I has some of my my video. Okay, so with that video, it's actually a 3-minute video from a colleague on how to record studio in studio. So you can use that as well. Do you have access to that 3-minute video? When you click on studio on the far left column, just want to see if you can see that video. Okay, I'm not sure if you can hear me. I can't know. Okay, so that video is only nothing there. So it's only recording my videos. It hasn't made it available to you. I can share the link to you on how to record on Studio. So that it gives you an option if you want to record yourself on Studio. So Studio is a little bit like PowerPoint, if you can see there. Your PowerPoint slide will be as the background, and your video or the video of yourself will be as a little screen down there. So it's a little bit like PowerPoint. The only difference is it stays on your Canvas shell. So you can always go back and check and post. I mean, if you lose the link, you stay there. I'm actually assuming that all the devices will be the same. If you use your phone, the video will be saved in your phone as well. But yeah, that's the only difference. So now if I go back to the course, and look into assignment 3. So with assignment 3, for the requirement, it has been changed to the 11th of February. And remember, you don't submit the video recording, but you submit the PowerPoint with the link of the video recording, because there's no video submission on Canvas. So what you would actually have is 2 aspects or 2 sections in your PowerPoint. You have a part A of risk management. What are the potential risks that might affect your project based on the urgent news? Just bear that in mind. It's not you thinking about random risk. You have to go to the urgent news, read the urgent news, and try to think about the risk that would come because of that announcement that you got. So that's part A. Yes, but I insist, Omer, that it's with the camera, because I insist that I want a video. When I say video, I mean not video of the PowerPoint, but video of you speaking. Because there is one element where it's about the way you express yourself. So it's hard for me to see how you're expressing yourself just by listening to you. I want to visually see the person who is actually explaining. So now with that part A, I said you go to the urgent news, you read the urgent news and think about what sort of issue, because that's actually communication from a senior manager to you. And they're telling you some of the issue that they know would happen or have experienced or are worried about. Depending on your case, it's different urgent news. So without the thing that they're worried about or the thing might happen, the one clarification about, you have to brainstorm what potential risk might be deducted from that might affect your project because of that particular email or announcement. And once you think about the risk, you will record in your risk register with all the columns, starting from the risk ID to the indicators, including the risk description, the category, the likelihood of that main risk, the consequence, the rating, and the mitigation measure of the response. If you think about additional risk, because that risk is huge, you might think of residual risk as well. So what would be the likelihood, the consequence, and the rating of residual risk? And who will be responsible for that, and what sort of indicators or sign will tell you that this risk is actually happening? So this is part of your risk register, which is part of your risk management. And then the change control is how would you do about it? So you have to respond to your senior manager, and you have to reassure that senior manager that you can still achieve the project goals within the time, scope, budget, and resources. In order to do that, you need to explain how you're planning to implement the changes. So you will use the change control log, where you will record the process involving from this person who has requested a change, the person who will be authorizing it, what's the statute of that, so if you have done that, and how you're planning to overcome that. So just bear in mind that you do already have your cost done in 2A, you have the time done in 2A, you have the procurement in 2B, so everything. So at the end of your presentation, you have to reassure the senior manager that you're still within the budget, if you're still, and how. So perhaps you want to show the table and say this is where we are with the budget, and if I implement the change that you have requested, we will still have this much amount of budget left, so we are still on track. And if I implement the change that you have requested, we're still on time because we're implementing that in this period of time. So you can show that, you can even highlight in different color where the change will be implemented in. So this is actually where, if you haven't done nothing for 2A and 2B, you will have a lot to do because your assignment will includes a little bit of 2A and 2B as well. So think about that, your urgent use, what area, knowledge area it affects, because they integrate how other area will be affected as well. So if it talks about supplier, perhaps you want to think about your procurement, your budget, your time. How you going to be still on track based on what you have assumed earlier. And that's what you need to conclude with your presentation. So you will be assessed on the way you demonstrate understanding of the issue raised in your urgent use and how you identify some of the problem area or the risk, and you have evaluated them and you have recorded them in your risk register, and how effectively you sort of understood the communication and make sure that the project or your response is communicated succinctly and clearly and convincingly. So your response to what? Your response to that particular news based on the change management control that you will provide. So there's two aspects of it. The risk is there to show that you understood what has been asked from you or what sort of the potential risk involved in that particular email. And the change is how you're planning on responding. Yes, John, you have a question.
Yeah, Erica, it's just about the how to lay out the assignment, just to make sure I understand it and the rest of the class do. The assignment's about 5 minutes long, so we create about 5 slides explaining all this stuff, and we video record ourselves explaining the presentation. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Erica.
Okay, not a problem. So you'll be assessed on the project risk, but it's identification of the risk related to the urgent use. So you start with your urgent use and you're trying to brainstorm what sort of risk might come from that urgent use. And also you have to assess it and include it, the consequence likelihood. So all of this is part of your risk register. That's the project risk here. And the change control here is the solution proposed with realistic budget, resources, and everything, and time as well. So how you'll be responding to that, and how you would implement the change. And also it's the video recording. So the way you articulate the problem, the risk, and how you actually reasoning on how you would implement the change, and also how you're using clear language and so on. So the way you present as well will be part of your marking criteria. So now if I go to the assignment here, for those who haven't seen it, Your screen might look a little bit different from mine, but the urgent news are under assignment. And if you click on the urgent news here, you have urgent news for all the cases, okay, the different cases. So if I click on one here, it's like we say just read between the line, okay? So this is for the Volkswagen Mexico team, okay, the project management team coming from the senior manager. So just bear with me. I'll give you an example. Let me read this. To the project management team, I'm writing to bring to your attention the current issues of meeting vehicles production targets. So you can actually tell that this is actually on the final product, okay? Meeting the target of the final product. The plant has capacity to build 2,500 units per day. However, it's currently running at around 1,900 as the car maker resolves the diesel emission scandal in the US and in Europe. If you remember back in the days, there was some sort of scandal. I think it was around 2018. I was still in Sydney back then, so yeah, it could be 2017 or 2018 when I was still in Sydney. There was some scandal regarding Volkswagen diesel emissions, and that has affected the market as well, and continue to affect the market in other parts of the globe as well. So because of that scandal that keep continuing to affect the market, the target of the production is quite low. So they were expecting to be 2,500 units, but they're having 1,900. And it's explaining here we employ around 14,000 people directly and 10,000 indirectly in the supply chain. So it's actually mentioning the supply chain, it's actually mentioning the target product. So supply chain, when you hear that, what it means is it means procurement. So that issue or that risk would affect the procurement issue as well. Okay, it's affecting the end products, so the number that you need to produce. But ultimately, this is because of the supply chain. Supply chain means procurement. Just bear that in mind. So your risk is a risk related to procurement here. We need to ensure how suppliers can produce at the quality and the quantity that we need, and our logistic provider can deliver parts to us at the required speed and timing. So you can tell that that supply chain, which would affect the procurement, will also eventually affect the quality, the quantity of the product, but also the time. So when you respond to that, you have to reassure your senior manager that you will still be on time by doing this, and that. And they say here we rely on our road, rail, and port partner to meet future demand and quality standard. So this is just another additional information. We're also currently experiencing space limitation at the car makers' main ports, including Acapulco on the Pacific coast, which handles export to Asia and especially Veracruz on the Gulf Coast, Volkswagen primary export and import hub. So even though I remember what I said, some projects close by having an additional department of service. In case of Volkswagen, it's not just making the parts, but also it's delivering the parts as part of the project. So that project extends to that. But here the issue is you don't have enough space in the usual ports in Acapulco. So that's also will be part of the procurement or perhaps the product release. Where would you put your products? So that's also a problem that you need to deal with. It says Acapulco has just 3,500 spaces and lacks a rail link, and Veracruz has only 2,000 spaces. Before we had this constraint in port space and equipment, we used to move around 30% of vehicles coming into Veracruz and Acapulco directly to dealers. This has not only affected the quality of our production line, but also has caused concern in meeting the budgeted target. Please make sure that your team brings more alternative way to avoid this issue with the required budget and deadline. So where would you store the cars for it to go to the dealers? Because you actually have limited space. You also have problem with your procurement, as I mentioned earlier, because of the suppliers. Okay, So there are two issues here. There's issues of getting the supply, procurement issues, and you also have issues with delivering the product. Remember, as part of your work, you've been hired not only to make parts, but also to deliver the vehicles where they need to be delivered. So how would you deal with that? You have to brainstorm the risk. Risks are easy to brainstorm because it comes straight away from the urgent needs. But solution, you could actually offer different types of solution. I won't say anything to you, but look into as a sort of lead. Is there any other port around Mexico besides Acapulco and Veracruz where you can store those vehicles or send those vehicles to the dealer? So that's one way that you could think about one of the solutions we got to that. But what about the procurement? How would you make sure that with the supply chain you have those people in time for the quality and the quantity of the project that you need or the product that you need? So that's what you need to think about for assignment 3. I hope this gives you a little indication of where you're heading with the assignment 3. And that's all with regard to what you have done in 2A. So if you are trying to change your procurement a little bit, you have to refer to 2B. If you are trying to change, actually, I understand that not all of you have done everything in 2A and 2B. You can talk to your other um, colleague, particularly if there is one of them that has done procurement, you can ask the colleague. But your response here is individual response. So your response will have to be individual, and you have to find your solutions individually as well. You can all brainstorm the same risk because it's one universal urgent use for this case study, but the change control and the risk will have to be individual. Any questions so far? I think the change control and the solution, so not the risk. The risk can be brainstormed by the whole team. If you want to do the brainstorming of the risk together, you can still do it within your team, but your solution will have to be individual. So that's Volkswagen, and the other popular one is Hume. So if I click on Hume Urgent News here, okay, so I'll go straight away to the main test. To the project team, I'm writing to bring to your attention the current issue regarding street covenant on the construction site. I was very impressed that a lot of you already in your project charter and your assignment 2A in terms of the scope, I actually have included the covenants in the WBS. So that was very good. So if you've done that, that's really very easy for you. So the issues here is about the covenants. Does anyone know what a covenant means? Just to double check that everyone is quite confident and know what a covenant is. What is a covenant? When we say covenant, what do we mean by that? Never heard of covenant before. I have. You have gone quiet again. Oh no. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. So sorry. It's gonna be something else. Okay. I was asking about the covenants. Does anyone know what a covenant is, or have heard of a covenant? No. Okay. Anyone work in the? If you Google covenant, it says a formal writing or statement of exchange of promise. A covenant was signed. No, that's not the one. An agreement. Agreement by lease, deed, or legal contract. Okay, so the problem with Hume City Council is that some of the lands where the construction is being done actually don't belong to the government. They are private properties. Okay. because there was some legal agreement back in the days that they belonged to those private people. Now, if you didn't know that and you plan without actually thinking of the scope of those covenant issues, then you have to think about that since assignment 1. So in the earlier news, it says you are unable to commence construction unless the covenants are removed from the title. So the title is the uh, the ownership of the land, okay, and the covenant is the agreement that is signed for that particular owner to have that land. So now, some of the land you will have to remove the title, get the title, otherwise you won't be able to build anything on top of that because they're private properties, let's put it that way. And currently, there are 15 adjacent traders or businesses that have right over the title resulting from the covenant. So there are 15 of them that actually have a right over some of the land where the construction will actually happen. So the archaic covenant will need to be removed by adopting one of the following options prior to construction commencing. Otherwise, the construction will be halted if any of the traders object. So the issue here, or the risk here, is the fact that you have those 15 businesses that own part of the land. So it could actually happen that they refuse to give up their ownership. So if they refuse, you won't be able to start. If you don't start, the process will be delayed. So there is even residual risk as well. If they refuse to remove the or to sign away the covenant to give the right over it, there will be major delay with the project. Yes, Brendan?
So, Erica, so in a business sense, like you might be Erica Proprietary Limited and you're a customer of mine, and to guarantee your debt, you put up your house and I take a covenant over that. And then if you try and sell your house, you can't because I've got the covenants over that. Is it sort of similar to that? Is that how we're that type of...
Yes, there's some similar things in the UK as well. And it's well, one of the investment property, it's exactly what Brendan has explained. One of the investment property that my partner had got here has a covenant over it. So technically, he can't do any work unless he gets permission for it. In another way, I can explain it with other country. For example, in the Philippines, and if you're not a Filipino, or if you're not Filipino born, what I mean is you will never own a land because you have to be born as a Filipino to own a land. But you have the right to buy land as a foreigner. It's just when you will be building, you have a covenant that belongs to someone else. And you have to ask the person to give you permission to build on top of the land that you bought. But in Australia, it's pretty much what Brendan put that it's like the land somehow belong to someone, to those 15 businesses there. But for you to actually have the right to build on that, they have to give you permission to build on top of it. So that's pretty much the scenario here. So the risk here is very clear. The risk is for them to say no to you, that they will not give up their title, and no, you can't build on top of that land. That's the risk here. Now, the good thing with this particular case study, if as a senior manager, because I've done similar job before, I gave you sort of options that you could actually think of as a solution and tell me what you think. So the first option here is for you to approach those all 15 traders and negotiate with them to sign an agreement to abdicate the covenant. Not that this strategy to be successful, you require the signatures of all 15 traders because all of them have equally the same rights on them. So you're probably gonna have to negotiate with them to send an agreement where they're giving up their covenant for you to build on top. So that's one option. The second option is to seek a planning scheme amendment that will require formal planning process, public advertisement, and a VCAT hearing of objections. So that's a little bit extreme. It's actually going or bringing to the legal team and bringing to court, where you're asking if they could amend that planning scheme. So trying to change it. Remember, when things have already been signed, it's really hard to get to change. But because this is a public council that will be built, you might win it if you have a lot of backing, I would say. And that would take 6 to 8 months as a process. It might even take longer with the pandemic. Nowadays, everything is long now. So this is one or two options. Perhaps you could also think as the two options might be applied in a way. Why? Because you could approach the 15 trader and try to negotiate and they refuse. If they obviously refuse, you have to go to court for it. So you might find yourself in a scenario where you will apply the two. Now, the thing is, you might think, oh, it's very easy, this one, because I've already have the solution. You don't have to think about a solution. There are a lot of residual risk here. You would also see the time, the delay there is also one of the residual risk. So when you think about the covenant issue, you have to think about that main risk, but also the residual risk. And when you're proposing a solution, you have to think about what sort of step do you think you would take to implement option one, option two, or the two of them. Because to actually negotiate with someone, you have to have a counter offer. And I want to hear what's your counter offer to them. You're not going to tell me I will negotiate with them and that's a solution. No, that's not a solution. How would you negotiate with them? Because we're talking about me as a senior manager being involved in that particular project. I want you to know what sort of negotiation you would take place with them. What sort of offer would you give them to get them to sign? Because people don't give up their ownership or title to that. I'll give you the scenario of the Philippines. With the Philippines, I know a couple that bought the land there, but they're French. Because of all the covenant issue, because they are not Filipino born, even though they've been living there for years, they had to do a sort of a counter offer. The counter offer or the negotiation they had with the people that own the land or the covenant was to give them some percentage because they bought the land, they have a house in the front, and they told me they have a house in the back and they have a shop in the front. They will give them a bit of percentage of some money, payment money that they will get per month just because they allowed them to build on top of their land. So when you negotiate, you have to give someone something. And what would be that offer? I want to hear it from you as part of your solution. And it has to be something that is very realistic and something that is normally you will want something that is within budget, time, and also that's something that doesn't impact the projects greatly. But if you think that you want to reassure me and say, in case they say no to my offer, we might go to VCAD, how would you fit your process of going to court within the time frame that you have allocated for the budget, I mean for the project? And how are you thinking of paying for that? Okay, it's just something you have to bear in mind because at the end of that urgent news, you can tell that the senior manager is very worried about the time because it's talking about time again to tell you that regardless of the solution you're thinking of implementing, how would it fit with the current time that you have developed? Any questions on that so far? Okay, so what else do we have as a popular case study? For Heathrow, if I read, I'm going to skim through quickly. Baldwin for Eleanor. Okay. Let me go to Baldwin first and then I'll go to Heathrow. Okay, here we are with Baldwin Water. So with Baldwin, you have the project management team, to the project management team. Your attention to the current issues regarding stormwater management brought forward by the federal government Can you hear me? Okay. Forwards by the federal government and Cleveland Environmental Protection Agency. The installation of impervious surfaces such as concrete, asphalt, and roofs around the site have prevented water, including rainwater or melted snow that runs off the site, from being absorbed. As a result, pipe systems have been overwhelmed during storm events, leading to the discharge of several liters of untreated sewage into local waterways. This is very clear. You can tell that there is issue with the installation and the pipe is actually overwhelmed and they are discharged. The risk is pretty much on the scope, the way the work has been done, poorly done. Besides contaminating nearby water sources, improperly managed stormwater have been causing some infrastructure damage, habitat destruction, stream bank erosion, and downstream flooding. And you also have other risks also. So the risks are really clearly mentioned here that are actually some of them are residual risk of the poor work that have been done. Now, however, we can't afford to miss the deadline of the project as it will be another 12 weeks or so to develop a solution to reduce sewer overflow. So that actually tells you already the solution. The solution is for you to reduce that sewer overflow, isn't it? But the senior manager is telling you we worry about do we have enough time to do it? Because we only have 12 weeks. This 12 weeks is the 12 weeks of the additional 12 weeks or leeway that is being added here. So perhaps you already have developed your time. And according to the senior manager, the experience that she had, she's thinking it might take you 12 weeks to do that. And do you think you have enough time to include that or to have it all done by 12 weeks? There is serious pressures from the commercial division not to lose the 2 million revenue from the fine that could possibly be served by the environmental agency. So we don't have a choice. We do have to fix those things because otherwise the fines will keep increasing. If we have more fines from the environmental agency, that means we actually going over our budget. We want to do everything to reduce or even to completely lose the fine that have been posed upon us because of those issues here. And to top it all, if we don't get this delivery, our key stakeholder will not be able to operate, exposing us to major penalty payment in excess of 3 million per month. So we have also the issues that if we don't get it fixed, all the stakeholders might actually fine us as well because we're not respecting what we're supposed to, the agreement we made with them. So we want to avoid a 2 million fine. We also want to avoid the penalty payment of 3 million. So we want to make sure that we overcome all of these issues within the 12 weeks. This is something is feasible. So you do have the risk. You do have the big issue. You know the solution is to actually reduce that sewer overflow. But how would you reduce that? And would it fit within the current budget and the current time frame that you have allocated, even though you know that it might take you 12 weeks, where would you fit that 12 weeks within your dead or your timeline? That's what you need to provide for Baldwin Water. Any questions? Okay, so I hope you can still hear me because I think my sound is going off and on and off. So I will go to the heater. Yes, Rachel, you have a question?
Yeah, so for the Baldwin one, we're suggesting a solution and assessing the risk on the solution and confirming how we can fit it within budget and in time.
Yes.
All right, easy. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, so for the Heathrow, let me just go back up. Yeah, this is Heathrow. Heathrow is a big project, so the urgency is quite big as well. Just bear with me, okay? Unlike the others. you can see that some of the urgencies are very different. They give you very detailed risk, so you can actually brainstorm it straight away from the urgent news. Some of them is very broad, so you have to do a lot of thinking for the solution and all that. So in terms of Heathrow, this is the urgent news. Like I said, it's a bit long. So I'm writing to bring to your attention the current issue regarding both meeting target on carbon emission as well as on air quality and noise. It's a big thing in London here. If you drive in London, you get fined for carbon emissions. So you have to pay it in advance. It's quite a nightmare. I've got cousins don't want to come and visit me here just because they know they're gonna have to pay for carbon emission or ULE's fee. To give you an idea, if you miss out on the payment, you get the £80 fine. So pound is a bit double of Australian dollars. So you get $160 one way. And if you drive the second way, so you get double of that as a fine per day. Can you imagine? So that's ULEs, and that's part of the whole carbon emission that you have to pay to drive in London. So the Heathrow Airport is in London, so they worried a lot about those fines as well. So it's a bit similar to Baldwin with their environmental people. So to meet targets on carbon emission as well as on air quality and noise, many environmental groups have expressed the concern that the refurbishment of Terminal 1 will make meeting our carbon emission target near impossible, and that local people will suffer as a result. So you're doing a refurbishment of a Terminal 1. The problem is because of all those rules and regulation in London here, when you do construction, you have a target that you can't go above. If you go above that emission target, particularly because it's an airport and there is frequent traffic with airplanes, if you go above that carbon emission, you will actually suffer the consequences, which means you will be fined by that. So Heathrow Airport and the Department of Transport believe that emissions targets can be met with technological advances. So they think we might use some technology that might actually help us to reduce carbon emission when we're trying to refurbish Terminal 1. So what sort of technology? That's what you have to think about, because the issue here is whatever technology you're using to refurbish has to be some technology that helps to reduce carbon emission. I would say think about some of the biggest airports, especially biggest airports in Europe here. Belgium is one country. I'm just giving you a little bit of a heads up, but you can think of others. They have refurbished their airport as well, and they use some very quite advanced technology to reduce carbon emission. Especially European country, I would have seen Asian, but the other Asian countries follow their own rule in terms of carbon emission. They don't really respect the overall rule. But European countries and American, when I mean American, I mean North America, so US, they tend to follow carbon emissions rules. So trying to see the different airports, what sort of technique that they're using to reduce carbon emission. So that's one issue with carbon emission risk, and the solution would be technological technique, advanced technique that you could implement there. But there is another issue as well. However, we are currently experiencing issues with the cost. The planned cost of the project was around 14 billion. Just bear in mind that 40 billion is not Terminal 1 only, it's the whole airport refurbishment. And now it's expecting to reach 25 billion because that's a program. Program means a group of projects. One of the projects is Terminal 1 that you are involved in, but the overall program is actually going up the cost. The cost increase came from a frequent request by airlines to increase the number of gates from 35 to 39 in Terminal 1. So the scope that has changed. Okay, so I'll get back to the question on Collaborate Ultra. I have to continue with this. The cost increase came from a frequent request by airlines, so they requested to increase the gates from 35 to 39 in Terminal 1. Okay, so the more gates would actually increase the projects, would increase the program. The government has suggested that any exceeding costs will ultimately be paid by passengers through changes levied by airports. So you might think that Elena has to go, not a problem. If you actually have to go, don't worry, because this is just the assignment. We finished the course. Anyone that want to go is free to go. Okay. So the taxpayer will not cover this, even though the government has suggested to actually increase air tickets, which actually is something that has come on the news even recently. I'm not sure if you follow the UK news. And Heathrow Airport has said that they would increase the flights to pay for some of the work there. And taxpayers have said no, you can't increase the flight tickets, especially the airplane companies. They refuse to do that. So there is serious pressure from our commercial division from the project to meet the budgeted targets and avoid any additional restriction on night flights or 6.5 hour scheduled night flight ban that could possibly be served by the Environmental Protection Agency. So you can't really increase the number of flights as well because you had the Environmental Protection Agency that might actually fine you, but it's only the flights at night, so you could find other solution. So you do have the increase in cost here that we need to cover, and what potentially would be a way for you to cover that. Forget about increasing night flights because of the noise of people that live around. The environmental agency might actually have an issue with that. So brainstorm the two biggest issues here, one with the carbon emission and the other with the number of gates, the scope that would actually result in residual risk with increasing cost. How would you deal with that? What sort of solution would you propose? And obviously, that's something that you have to present. Okay. So any other case study here that I need to cover for urgent news of the people that are involved? So you can tell the urgent news is very straightforward. And from those urgent news, you will have to brainstorm the risk and offer potential solution. I have a question, I think it was David. You say, Erica, and you will be assessed on, you should reflect on the experience you had with dealing with any stakeholder directly or indirectly involved in the project. How did you overcome disagreement across your team? So David is gone, but in answering your question, in case you look into the recording, this will be when you're implementing, for example, the covenants for Hume City Council, you have to discuss on the negotiation how it will be done with the stakeholders. And like I said, all the knowledge I integrate together, so they link together. So when you implement your solution, think about any sort of disagreement that might occur with your stakeholder. How would you deal with your stakeholder expectations or requirements as well? Okay, so any questions? Next week, it will be a sort of a revision drop-in section. If you have any question on your assignment, final assignment,